IVM.
Many modern brands have been built by creators not just by keeping a keen eye on the consumer, but also from having the ability to take the essence of their brand and personal sensibility and building horizontality around it. To be able to take the essence of their sensibilities and value systems and extending it across the products they build, and also using that same balance in their collaborations with other brands, both new age as well as traditional, to build true scale. One such creator for me is Masaba Gupta. So I thought it'd be interesting to understand how she's grown her brand, also how she's created so many varied products with an almost unifying aesthetic. All this and more on this week's episode of Advertising is Dead. I'm Arun Girala, the co-founder and content chief of The Glitch, and we'll be right back with Advertising is Dead.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.
Welcome back to Advertising is Dead with Masaba. Hi Masaba, welcome on the show.
Thank you. It's my first time and I've been seeing all of your little posts. Oops, there was a doorbell. I'm sorry.
That's right. We're all used to this now.
Now it's just the new norm, yeah.
Exactly. So, obviously I thought it'd be interesting and I talk about, many things associated what you actually do, right? And I think that a lot of the listeners we have on the show will get a bunch of insights on it. Can I kick it off? Maybe I want to start at the beginning, right? How did you get into doing what you do? Was this always a frame of interest, or was design and just across? But how did this kind of start for you?
I think I always say, fashion found me because I wasn't somebody who really wanted to do this. It wasn't even plan C. It was just one of those things that, when you're young, you have a good eye for clothes, and how every parent thinks, oh, she wears nice clothes and has an eye for color and things like that, so maybe she'll be good at this. So that was always the approach. But my mom actually was very adamant that I do design. I do something in design. And she basically had the one thought that you should always do something that you can do your whole life, so this isn't something that, you can't do when you're 75 or 80, or that you can't do no matter where in the world you're at, so she always believed in that one notion. But I think for me, I hated like fashion school, and I hated the technicalities. I didn't enjoy the process at all. I just knew that I loved making things, and I liked making things that I could wear. So that became, I think that sort of formed my aesthetic when I was growing up. I never bought things from the market as they were. I would always cut them up and, make little combinations. So it was always there. But literally, I was studying music in London when I got really homesick and I said, I want to come back. And the next thing I know, I was literally standing opposite SNDT, which was my fashion college. And I just walked in, gave the entrance exam, and the rest is history, So it was not planned out at all. But I knew that when I did my first show, even though it was in college, I knew that this would be the thing that I want to do for life in any shape or form. So yeah, here I am.
So the part that you spoke about fashion school, right? And I've many times had a conversation with people going to come on the show about education, because we've all in some form or the other been through some sort of, I would say, formal education to before we kind of got into what we're doing. And did you kind of feel that it was restrictive? What was your issue with them? I won't want you to go sideways on it.
Oh no, I have actually gone pretty and got scolded at from my college for this one time. No, but frankly, I think that an education can both empower you as well as stifle you, especially in a creative profession like this, where I think it's so important to just have a keen eye and to keep an open eye. And sometimes when you're doing everything by the book, you forget to really look around you, and you also kind of forget that there is so much to be found in just being spontaneous about certain things. Yeah. So I think that for me is very important, especially in fashion. I think it applies to music, it applies to art, it applies to anything that is a hyper creative profession where 90% of your job is to just keep your eyes open and keep looking, So I think for me, what happened was I failed at all of the, pretty much all the subjects that had any technicalities involved, including accounts. And I was just great at like illustration or, anything that involved me to be sitting and doing what is coming naturally as a flow. And I do think that a lot of designers in India and maybe abroad don't really allow that natural flow to come through because they think that it's so important to know everything that's in the book. And I think that it really affected me in a way that today I can safely say that me and a lot of the girls in my batch, we only know how to make things like, say, for example, pattern making was a big part of our course. And we only know how to make a pattern of a piece that we've read about in the book because there was an A to Z instruction. But if you gave us something that we haven't ever seen before, we wouldn't know how to apply our minds to it. So I think application of your natural mind is something that doesn't happen in a lot of creative courses.
I think it's interesting also because your style and sensibility, if I look at anything which you design, it's so distinctive, right? I mean, I was talking to a couple of people before this and I was just kind of getting some thoughts in terms of what I could talk to you about. And someone said that you're almost a genre by yourself because someone might see a print, it might not even be something which you have done. But so it's a very Masaba kind of style.
Right.
And so I thought it'd be interesting. So what would you say your frame of almost inspiration, or rather, what would you actually categorize? How have you kind of come up with that style?
I think it's if I have to define the work I do, I would say it's using inanimate objects, everyday life, and putting it onto a canvas and making print out of it, right? And I think the brand has always been known for its print. So the joke is that whenever there's a funky, cool print, it's a Masaba print, And I think that that's the common notion. So I think with me, what's happened is that it started with my palm print, which is essentially my palm that I put onto a piece of fabric, and we just made like different variations of it. And I think it doesn't come from a specific place of, this is what the brand has to be. But I just think it's all about conversations. And I think I find clothes that are just pieces of fabric and don't have anything, any depth, I find them really boring. And I think for me that comes through print, because frankly speaking, I'm very, very weak when it comes to, like I said, pattern making, when it comes to making pieces that are, beautifully cut or beautifully finished. I'm not good at that. So I understood that when I was 19 and I started the label. I said, look, this is not my forte. My forte is taking these beautiful things that I see and just making them into print. And a lot of the time, they're just, an imagination. There's something that I've read. There's something that I've been told. Like recently, I did a print that said overdone, because I was told that my prints are so overdone so much in the last 10 years that I said, I need to make a print of this. So for me, it's an outlet in a way. And that's where my inspiration comes from. It comes from people. It comes from conversations I've had. It comes from criticism. It comes from applause. It comes from everything. And I think that's how it became like a mood board of my mind in a way. Yeah.
What I also find interesting is that, I think on one aspect, many designers start off with let's say, okay, we're doing specific kinds of things, right? You would say we're doing clothes and maybe kind of accessories, etc. There was a point till which you were focusing primarily on that. I think at some point you kind of branched out to say that your design sensibility could kind of extend to anything, right? And I think that
Correct.
for me was the most interesting part when I actually started looking at all the stuff you're doing. I mean, you actually started taking the brand into places that most people wouldn't expect you to go. So I want to kind of talk about how that happened, but also kind of understand, how you evolved almost, or rather kind of spread out your own design thought process from garments to everything else.
It's funny, but now that I look back and when you ask me this, I feel like that was the biggest strength and the biggest weakness of the brand. Like, it was the best decision and the worst decision at the same time. And it never really, I don't think we sort of chased it. It kind of naturally came to the brand. I remember I think one of the first few collaborations were for Tata Nano. I remember when they were doing a whole rejig of their brand, and they said, we want to just associate it with, influencers or passion people and artists, etc. And they made me design this one Nano, which was blue and pink polka dots, and it had orange leather seats. And they said, it's a piece that to show people what it's like, and to have something that's a piece of art, but it's a car. And I remember the campaign was called Masabaness. And I found that so interesting. And I think that's when the whole journey of the brand extension began. And I realized that, a lot of brands in India stop at one thing. So they put themselves in a box and they're like, okay, we do lehengas and we're only going to do lehengas our whole life. We're going to do kurtas, so it's going to be 5 different types of kurtas our whole life. I knew that the print portfolio of the brand was so vast that there were so many things that actually didn't look good on clothes but would look great on product. And we just said, why not lend ourselves to everything in the universe of product that we can? And that's how it started. It also became the biggest marketing story for the brand. I think I'd say maybe more than 60% of what the brand is today is because of the various collaborations we've done. And I think that the charm is that we never did something that we are not already good at. So it was always something that we didn't know how to do well, like cars. So we did Fiamma Deville's shower gels. We did Titan watches. We did, Lakme lipsticks. There was everything that we didn't know how to do. We only did those collaborations. And I think that's very important for a brand, not to sort of step on your own foot and say, do things that you already know how to do, but you're just tying up with another giant because you think they might have a bigger, say, marketing spend, or they might have bigger reach, etc. So we only did things that we didn't know we could not do, that we knew we couldn't do for sure. And I think for me, it became a way to reach out to a different kind of consumer. I've always believed that my brand has a much younger following than I even know. And I think that for that following, for that consumer who's always like looking at my Instagram or looking at our product, they can't touch it and feel it. So, which is why we introduced socks, and which is why we introduced, Nykaa lipsticks. And I feel like that was a way to introduce the new consumer, the young consumer, who's going to be the, I hope, loyal consumer of tomorrow to the brand at a very, very affordable price. So that was the whole idea behind it.
Now that you mentioned consumer, right? Because the modern consumer in many ways is called they're spoiled for choice on one end. On the other end, you always try to figure out what they'll be loyal to. Because I think initially in a time much before this, you didn't have as many options, so the tendency to be loyal was a lot more. How did you look at the consumer? Like, in terms of, like, when you look at a consumer and say, okay, this is how I kind of build almost a continuing relationship with this specific consumer. How do you look at doing that? Or is that something you don't even look at as much?
Now that you ask me, I just realize I don't, because it's not something
Maybe
I gave. Yeah, I think that the trick is not to think about it so much. But the one thing that I do know is that our communication with our consumers is always like super honest. Even if we're talking about a certain product, if we've screwed up somewhere, if we've said something just for the sake of saying it and not really followed up with it, we instantly apologize. We instantly take ownership, and I think that is a big way of just holding on to your consumer. I think the second thing is, I always believe that if you listen very closely, you can almost hear exactly what the consumer is saying that they want. And I think that's something we've always done, like, for example, inclusivity. And I think that's such a big topic, not just today, but for the past 2 years, where girls who are big, girls who have certain body types are just feeling left out of fashion.
True.
And we just decided, and trust me, a lot of people don't understand this, but for a designer label to adapt to so many things at once is, one, very expensive. Two, it's extremely hard, just in terms of processes, etc. And simple things like, if I have to make a certain type of a piece for a certain type of body type, there is a fabric consumption that goes in, which might be high or low, which I have to account for in my cost. But if I must do it for the brand, I must take that hit and do it anyway, right? Secondly, our campaigns, for example, became much more inclusive. We had different ethnicities, we had different skin colors, we had different body types, and even a 65-year-old woman on the campaign.
Yeah.
So I think we just started talking directly to the consumer, and we decided that we have to do everything in our power that they don't feel intimidated by this brand. And I think that's what happened to me when I was a young girl and I was growing up and I looked at all these brands. I was so intimidated because I said, oh my God, it looks like a dream. It's something I can't touch or feel, but I love to look at it. And I didn't want the brand to be just that. I wanted it to be something everybody could experience. Everyone felt that they could touch and feel. And I think that's what happened. So honest communication, inclusive communication, and I think just trying to stay ahead of the times,
Yeah.
At the risk of messing it up, we just had to make sure we had one step in front of them at all times, I think.
You make a very interesting point, right? Because there was a time when fashion was meant to be something that you aspire to, should almost feel like it's out of reach, which is why you would want more of it.
Yeah.
Or wanted more, but but honestly, right now, I think for the consumer, they need to feel like, okay, this is something that connects with me. So if it's too far away, then I can't connect with it, and maybe it isn't for me. So
yeah,
that's an interesting
but
way.
Varun, that brings us to what you said. Earlier there was so few options that you didn't have a choice but to say, oh my God, if I love this piece and I can't afford it, or I'm gonna save up, or if I can't fit into it, I'm gonna lose those 10 kgs and fit into it.
Yeah.
Today, I think affordability is the new aspiration. Where if you feel like or I think affordability and accessibility is the new aspiration. If you can't reach it, you'll move on to something else. If you can't afford it, you'll move on to something else, because there's so many options. So how do you keep people from moving on to the next best thing is, I think, the biggest part of this whole piece. Yeah.
How do you then take this process forward, especially when you're doing when you're collaborating, right? When you're collaborating with, let's say, larger brands, etc., because which you've done a lot of in recent times. How do you make sure that the way you work with them, that balance kind of stays? Because you obviously have guardrails which you don't want to cross. How does that? How do you make that part work?
I think for starters, we always review a collaboration on two things. Is this going to be marketing driven or sales driven? There's some collaborations which we've done which you may not have even really sort of heard of, or they might be more quiet, but those are purely sales driven. I think the other ones are out and out marketing driven things. And I think that most of the brands that come to us are brands that have been institutions in their own right, and they've been around for a really long time, and they have sort of lost touch of the new young consumer, which is why they reach out to me, because they think that we can speak to that consumer, we understand them, etc., and we can help that brand convert into a slightly younger, convert to a slightly younger audience, you know. And I think for me, it works because that brand has everything. I mean, they have data of all those years. They have a great pulse on consumer behavior, sentiment. They have a great understanding of retail, etc. So I think what happens is it's just like a great marriage of two brands, yeah. And I think we don't really think so hard about it. But I always say that I don't believe that everything has to be expensive for you to get people to want it. So the only thing I really put my foot down on is, guys, okay, if we're doing this and we're going to put so much energy into it, it should be affordable, you know. And which is why, you know, our collaboration with Titan Raga, for example, was such a huge success, because they were beautiful watches, almost like pieces of jewelry. And I think Titan Raga had never done like an elephant on their watch for how many years. And they said it worked, but it worked because the watch was like 12,000, 13,000 bucks, you know, which is, for a watch or a luxury watch, if you call it, is a great pricing, right? So I think that it works if you're price sensitive, or the collaboration works if you're price sensitive, but otherwise it never does, no matter how great your product is.
You know, you also just launched a range of fragrances, right, and perfume. So, and that was in the middle of lockdown. How was that experience, right? Because obviously must have been, I mean, for obviously would be different than what you would normally do. How was that?
You know, it was the best thing, because this is how I want to do launches my whole life. Because I was just sitting at home. I literally had shorts on, and it was the best thing ever. I didn't have any hair, makeup, fast, nothing. It was great, you know, because when actually the product was in the making for 2 years, and we said, look, guys, there's not going to be any right time to do this, but we got to do this because every product has an expiry, right?
Yeah.
And we said, let's just do a virtual launch. What is the one thing that really, you know, connects with the Nykaa consumer as well as the Masaba consumer, was that, you know, we really thrive on influencer marketing, on bloggers, on anything that's digital really is great for us, you know. Anything that we do offline, physical launches are always just a bonus. So the one idea that we had was, let's get a bunch of the most powerful bloggers in town together. And we launched the perfumes over a Zoom call. So it was like 10 bloggers. We did 2 sessions. We had 10 bloggers in one session, and we sent them the perfume beforehand so that they could experience it. And we just made it a really quick, I think it was 40 minutes, which is like a dream in like launch world, you know, because you're just like, no prep time, nothing. You just sit down in front of your, you know, the computers, and you're all set. And the main thing was, I said, okay, guys, how are we going to keep them engaged? Because I think it's really hard to keep someone engaged online. And we said, let's make them go through a quiz. Let's make them guess what the perfume is. And let's just have a freewheeling chat. So I think the beauty was, and I think that's the way virtual launches will be, that you can't have an agenda. You know, that's one. You can't want to hard sell the product. It's more just a really fun freewheeling conversation between a bunch of people who have this common interest, which is beauty, or which is fragrance, or which is clothes, and you just chat with them. And I think that's what it was. I think it was much stronger than any physical launch I've done. It reached out to a larger set of people. We have that launch data with us, and we have the launch, the entire sort of, you know, recording with us. We can use it over time to relaunch it again and again. So if you ask me, it's the greatest, most inexpensive, powerful way to connect with the consumer for 2 brands which are largely digital. I don't know if I can say the same if our brand wasn't really built on Instagram, but because it is, that's how it worked, I think.
No, that was going to be my next question, right? Because building a brand on Instagram, which is why when someone asked me that how they and I was putting this down, I said, how do I categorize you? And I said, like, the only way I can categorize you is as a creator. While I think that term is used a lot for, let's say, someone who's creating content on YouTube, etc. But I feel that what you do is, in a sense, being a creator, because you are looking at creating things that appeal to you, appeal to your aesthetic, but also then the way you kind of connecting and building your own audience is actually through ways in which a creator does, or what is considered to be a creator's domain, which is using a lot of social media, bloggers, influencers, etc.
Right.
What has your process been on that front? How have you looked at kind of doing that while keeping things authentic the way you do?
I think it's taken me a couple of years. I would say 5-6 years easily, because when I started off, I always did things, created things that I wanted or that I liked, and I never really thought so hard about, oh, is this something that is feasible? Is the consumer ready for this, etc. And then I think I slowly sort of, bridge that gap between creativity and commerce, which I think is frankly the hardest thing for a creator to do, because one is, how do you keep people interested in what you're doing? Two is, how do you keep yourself interested in what you're doing, which is, I think, hardest. And the third is, how do I make money off it? You know what I mean? So I think these are three such important pieces that we needed to figure out. But I think I've slowly found the balance. I always give my creativity and my creative mind much more importance, because I think if that is at peace, then everything else will always fall in line. But I think it was a conscious decision. I had to make that very informed call that, I can't just make pieces because I believe that I'm this creator and this creative soul, and I have to just create things in order to, treat them as an outlet. I do have to look at many other factors now, because we do have a retail presence. Yeah. So it was tough. And the only thing I ever think of is that I don't think of my clothes as art. I think of them as commercial art. They are pieces that you just don't want to keep looking at and not be able to, like I said, touch and feel. So I always make them keeping in mind that I start from the dream, I start from the fantasy, and then I sort of boil it down to what it would be like for a layperson's dream. And it's still a dream, but it's a much more sort of watered down version of it, I would think.
So is that your way of kind of balancing the business side and the creative side? Is that how you would put it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of tantrums being thrown in the middle, but it's really hard, because I mean, some days we're like literally, and I also must say that earlier, I think as creative people and as brands, everything was driven just by, your gut or what you're feeling or what the trends are, etc. And I think today design is so driven by data, and that for me was the biggest switch that I had to make, because suddenly I had people telling me, okay, blue is the color of the season, so we must have 4 blue kurtas in the collection at any point. But some days I'm not feeling like blue kurtas, you know what I mean? But I still got to make them. So that's the tough part. But for every 4 blue kurtas, I make sure I have 8 hot pink ones that I would like, so that I'm satisfied. And I think that's the journey, and that's the balance that every creative person has to have.
So and does the data kind of come through many times? Would you say that, if you have to balance, if I had to say the balance is between the blue ones that the data is telling you to make and the pink ones that you said you really wanted to make, have you kind of seen them almost go neck to neck, or how does that kind of go? Or rather, do you keep an eye on that to say, here data, you were wrong, I was right?
Data has been, it's helped us grow. I won't lie. It's always helping you reach out to, a different consumer who didn't necessarily get what they wanted when they walked into your store, because it was full of hot pink kurtas earlier. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think it's helped us scale up. It's helped the brand become more unanimously, sort of just accepted. But I think it's, I would say it's a balance. If you talk about, like, when I talk about sales, I see that the aspirational or the more sort of hyper creative pieces always do as well as the super vanilla normal ones, and I think that's very encouraging, because the thing is, the beauty is that once you have consumers who walk in and say, you know what, we only want to wear that blue kurta and we only want it in this cut and this style, and there are women like that who have a certain style and they stick to it. But then as soon as they come to your store and they start, experiencing more and more of your clothes, they finally gravitate towards the hot pink, and they say, you know what, we don't mind experimenting with one of these. And then they slowly gravitate towards that and forget about the old pieces or the old style they had. So I think what happens is you introduce them and you sort of warm them up to creativity, but while keeping an eye on commerce. I would say that's how I would do it. Yeah.
So we kind of had to go back to the time when you decided to start this off. Did you think that you actually spread as wide across categories, or was it initially just like, okay, let me just see where this goes?
You mean like brand extension wise?
Right after fashion school.
Right.
When you were starting off, what was the idea? What was the idea then versus now? What do you think you've kind of your thought process kind of evolved to?
Oh God, it was so different. When I started off, I basically hated all the saris that were in the market because I thought they were obnoxious and so loud. And I said, oh my God, people need to make cooler saris because the young Indian woman is slowly moving away from the sari because, she's stuck with all these really hyper options, So the idea was for the brand to be a very cool young sari brand, and that's it. And we started, I still remember, with 20 saris. They were all with, they had a fan print on them. They had 2 feet on them. They had cows on them. They had birds on them. And we sent them to this multi-designer store because I didn't have my store at that time. And they were just scandalized. And they said, okay, well, we'll put it on the rack. It was $8,000 that time.
Yeah.
For a sari, and they thought the pricing was competitive, so they put it up there. But I was stuck in. It was literally like looking at these weird animals in between this jungle of sequins and bright gota and whatnot. And well, all the saris came back. None sold. And I think that's when we decided, okay, well, this was my dream. This was my fantasy to see women dressed like this. And it's not working out. So then I did a bit of a U-turn, and then we said, okay, maybe these prints don't work on saris, and maybe young girls want slightly more easier options to wear. And we put them on dhotis, on kurtas, on dresses. And we just did a more sort of fusion wear sort of aesthetic and put it there. And that worked really well. And once that worked, the saris suddenly started flying off the shelves. So I think it was really interesting because, we started off saying, oh my God, we just want young girls to, love Indian clothes. Because you know how it is, like when you're a young child, you literally have to be slapped to wear like a salwar kameez, because you're just like, oh my God, this is so boring. And I said, no, we're going to make it fun because Indian girls, young Indian girls need to be super proud of the sari and they need to be super proud of Indian silhouette, And
that we had when we were younger were terrible. I mean, I think I just like...
That's true. But I think still today, if you're like, oh my God, I have to wear a ghagra choli, I'm not going to wear one, So I think that was the dream that time. And today we, I think, are in a space where we do much more, I would say, affordable wedding wear.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it affordable luxury, but so people who don't want to spend an arm and a leg and a kidney for like a piece to wear at someone's wedding, we're in that space, and that's the niche we've carved. And things are different, but I think they're still good. And I think the one thing I always want to be is fluid. I always tell my team this, that nothing is set in stone ever in design, at least not in my company, because I want to be able to pivot at any time, So we will keep changing, I think.
So a large part of the audience that kind of listens to this podcast, right? They're either finishing up college, just kind of started off their careers, etc.
Yeah.
You have to kind of turn around to someone and say, who's like, okay, I have a design aesthetic. I want to create a lot of things, but if you kind of had turn around, can be advice, can be just like keep some things in mind. What would you say to them?
The first thing I would say is that wanting to be a fashion designer and a fashion entrepreneur are two very different things. Don't get them mixed up, and they don't require the same skill set. I think it's harder to be an entrepreneur because it requires you to have a completely different mindset. So you might be really, really good at design, but it's not necessary that you have a great eye for the business as well. The second thing I would say is that educate yourself, but not to the extent, like I said, where it stifles you or sort of changes your perspective on things. Same goes for internships. I think a lot of young girls, and I've seen this firsthand, do internships with really big designers, and you just see their aesthetic completely change, and they look like watered down versions of those big designers, and to a point where they don't have an individual voice. It's just literally like, somebody made like a piece that got rejected by the big designer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that to me is really sad. So that you should keep an eye out for. Internships are for just to absorb what a working space in creativity looks like, not to absorb somebody else's talent in a way. And I think the last thing I would say is that make mistakes, but try and make them as inexpensive as possible. You don't want to continuously do trial and error where you lose time, you lose money. It can be very, very disheartening. And I think as creative people, we're so emotional. We have a slightly more how do you say it, vulnerable mind, I think, than most people. We're more we just absorb things more. We're like sponges. And I think that I would say, while the whole world and the corporate world will always tell you that you must lose that quality, I would say don't lose that quality, because it's the one thing that keeps you, you have to be permeable to be able to design, right? And if you put your guards up and if you put all these walls around you, you can't see anything. And then what are you going to design for? And what are you going to design from? So I think that's very important. Young girls are constantly told, be less emotional, or, be like more, have a little bit of business mind and, thoda whatever, think a bit more practically. I think when you're young, you have the option to think a bit more illogically, and you should use that, because that makes you the stronger, smarter business person in your 30s, I would think. So, yeah.
Yeah, towards the end of every episode, and this kind of becomes a longer version than most people expect it to be. I do this segment called Humans of Advertising, right? Because I ask a set of really random questions. Sometimes they tend to ramble on, and it's not a rapid fire because it's never rapid. So if you had to turn around and tell someone that, okay, this is something which I'm a huge consumer of, but most people would not expect me to be a huge consumer of this X thing, what would that be? It could be anything. It could be anything that interests you, that you obsess over, that people wouldn't think that you would be.
Conspiracy theories, I think. I have been looking up the Malaysia Airlines crash for the past, I don't know how many years, and I do it every single day. What happened to that aircraft? Yeah. So I love conspiracy theories, I think. Yeah.
So I'm guessing you watched all those shows available on Netflix, on all the platforms.
I'm just every single thing. And I'm in bed and I'll be Googling this for like 3 hours straight, and I'm just like never find answers, but I'm still looking for it. So I think conspiracy theories, yeah.
And what can you put together in an instant?
What can I put together in an instant?
Yeah.
A mood board, I think. It can be anything. It can be for how do you say it? Like, it could be for jewelry, it could be for clothes, it could be for a house, it could be for flower arrangements, it could be for food. I can put a mood board together in seconds. Yeah.
Do you enjoy being on a reality show?
Oh my God.
I've been on the other side of things over there, so I thought it'd be interesting to ask you how that's been for you.
Oh, by the way, that's not a reality show.
I know it's not. I call these reality, I put them all under the same category of things, but...
Well, okay, all right. It's like a mockumentary, if you can call it that. But it's been great. I think I love it, and I would do it all my life. It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. And if I had to ask you a couple of things you would recommend in terms of books, or are you a podcast listener? Do you listen to podcasts?
No, unfortunately. Very, very poor podcast listener.
So what would
But
your
books.
recommendations in general be on books?
Books. There's the 5 a.m. Club, which I love. That's one of my favorites. The Secret, old cliche, but always works. 1,000 Splendid Suns, which is the last one I just read. Well, all kinds of, biographies, autobiographies. So Becoming by Michelle Obama, Open by Andrea Agassi, Serena Williams biography, all of these. And what else? My Sister, the Serial Killer is one of my really quick, fun reads as well. That's nice, yeah. So all of these.
Super. And this is my final question in general across all episodes. And everybody has their own version of it. Because of the name of the show. Why do you think advertising will not die?
Because humans are hyper consumers, and we learn the hard way. I think we forget very easily, we forgive very easily, and I think we're creatures of comfort. And I think advertising is pure comfort, because I think anything that, if you see some of the greatest ads and just marketing spins, I think everything just puts you in a really comfortable place. And I think humans are creatures of comfort. So I think as long as we're not pushed out of our comfort zone or are happy to be out of our comfort zone, we will always consume, and which will always result in advertising being very, very alive.
Super. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been fun. I hope it was fun for you.
Thank you. It was great. And I don't think I've done many podcasts. Maybe
this is the easiest
Pooja, it's so easy and it's great because you don't have to, you can be in bed and chatting. It's great. You don't have to show your face to anyone.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful.
Hence
Thank
I've
you.
done so many episodes so far.
Yeah, I can imagine. Great. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Really, really fun week, and I think that you guys should definitely check out some of the stuff we did. So we had Shifa Mehta, who is the host of the show Smile India, on the Paperback podcast. Really fun thing. On Edges and Sledges, our hosts had an episode just amongst themselves. No guests this time. Really fun show with lots of cool banter. I think you'll enjoy that quite a bit. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet had Shrishti Bell on. Shrishti is the head of Netflix in India, and I think you'll really enjoy that conversation as well. Also, do check out Uncle Please Sit. Joel and Tushar had Anuya Chatarkar on. Anuya hosts the popular YouTube channel Books on Toast. And don't forget others of your old favorites like The Habit Coach, Football Should Ball, All Things Policy. All of them are doing a great job during this pandemic, and you should definitely check them out. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have. Paisa Vaisa is brought to you by Paytm Money.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.